I have watched State of the Union addresses for decades. I have delivered them. I have sat in that chamber more times than I can reasonably count. And I can tell you this with absolute certainty. What happened on the night of February 24th, 2026 was not merely another annual speech. It marked a shift, a significant one. And the danger is that far too few people are taking it seriously. Most Americans woke up the following morning, glanced at the headlines, and moved on. The longest State of the Union on record, a duration of 108 minutes. A hockey team honored, Democrats shouted down, then life continued. That reaction is understandable. People are preoccupied with the cost of living, with rent, with groceries, with whether their children will be all right. Those concerns are real, but they are also precisely why this moment matters. Because the most consequential elements of that speech were not the theatrics that made the evening news. They were not the standing ovations or the confrontations. They were the quieter moments, the ones that passed almost unnoticed. A president standing just feet away from Supreme Court justices he had publicly attacked days earlier, dismissing their ruling as unfortunate. A claim offered without evidence that the opposition can only win elections by cheating, and threaded carefully through the address the early construction of a case that could lead the country toward yet another military confrontation in the Middle East. Those details matter. We will return to them. But first, it is essential to understand what a State of the Union address is meant to be. It is not entertainment. It is not a rally. It is meant to be an honest accounting, a clear-eyed assessment from the president to the people who entrusted him with power. When that accounting ceases to be honest, when it becomes performance rather than explanation, division rather than clarity, something foundational in a democracy begins to erode. Not dramatically, not all at once, quietly, gradually, in ways that most people only recognize when it is already too late. That is the concern here. Not this speech in isolation, but what it signals about what comes next. Context matters. It always does. When I delivered my own State of the Union address in January 1998, I was governing under intense pressure. That is well known. Yet I walked into that chamber focused on policy, on balancing the budget, on concrete plans for working families, because that is what the public deserved. Substance over spectacle. Contrast that with the position President Trump occupied on this occasion. His approval ratings sit near historic lows. Just 39% of Americans approve of his handling of the economy, the issue that matters most to voters. A partial government shutdown remains ongoing after Democrats refused to fund the Department of Homeland Security following the killing of 2 American citizens by federal agents in Minneapolis in January, Renee Good and Alex Pretty. Real people, real families. Their names were not mentioned once. 4 days before the speech, the Supreme Court struck down the president's signature global tariff program in a decisive 6-3 ruling. Even justices appointed by the president voted against him. He responded by publicly describing the decision as an embarrassment to their families. At the same time, 2 U.S. aircraft carrier groups were moving toward Iran, tensions in the region escalating while the 2026 midterm elections loom less than 9 months away, with the president's party facing significant political headwinds. That is the reality a president is expected to confront in a State of the Union address, the genuine state of the nation, the uncomfortable truths, not merely the convenient ones. Instead, what the country witnessed was 108 minutes of deflection, a president doubling down on the very choices that led him to this point. And whether the public is watching closely or not, the consequences of that decision will unfold regardless. So let us examine what was actually said, and just as importantly, what was not. President Trump declared the nation to be living in a golden age. He described an economy roaring like never before. Optimism has its place, but optimism must be grounded in reality. When 65% of Americans disapprove of a president's handling of inflation, rhetoric alone cannot bridge that gap. He claimed to have inherited record inflation. That is demonstrably false. When he took office in January 2025, inflation stood at roughly 3%, elevated but far from historic extremes. He repeated the assertion that tariffs are paid by foreign countries, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Every credible economic study shows that American consumers and businesses bear those costs. And then came the suggestion that tariffs might one day replace the federal income tax. That is not a policy proposal. It is a political fantasy. This, more than anything, set the tone for the evening. A speech heavy on assertion, light on substance, and detached from the economic reality most families are living through. What stood out most forcefully was not merely what the president chose to say, but what he deliberately left unsaid. The address devoted a substantial portion to immigration, delivered with graphic anecdotes and emotional appeals. It followed a familiar script. But conspicuously absent were the facts that explain why the country is currently in political deadlock. There was no mention of Renee Good, no mention of Alex Priddy, two American citizens killed by federal agents in Minneapolis. Their deaths directly triggered the Department of Homeland Security funding dispute that has resulted in a partial government shutdown. That context was entirely erased. When a president tells only the part of the story that suits his argument, the resulting debate is not merely incomplete, it is dishonest. For a speech that ran 108 minutes, the longest in modern history, the lack of a substantive legislative agenda was striking. There was no serious infrastructure proposal, no meaningful plan to address affordability, no clear strategy for easing the pressure facing families struggling with rent, food prices, and healthcare costs. For millions of households, these are not abstract policy questions. They are daily anxieties, yet the largest platform available to a sitting president was used to offer reassurance without solutions. Disagreement over policy is inevitable in a democracy. Disagreement over facts should not be. Yet much of the address rested on claims that simply do not withstand scrutiny. That alone would be troubling. But it is compounded by the fact that every element of a State of the Union address is intentional. Nothing is accidental. What is emphasized, what is omitted, who is challenged, who is honored, all of it reflects how a president understands the moment he is governing in. On that measure, the message was unmistakable. Affordability is the dominant concern for American families. Groceries, rent, healthcare, these issues define the public mood. The president had an opportunity to acknowledge that reality directly, to demonstrate understanding, and to outline a path forward. He did not. Instead, he returned repeatedly to the language of a golden age that large parts of the country do not recognize. That is not simply a misreading of public sentiment, it is a failure of empathy. Then came a moment that crystallized the tone of the evening. The president challenged Democrats to stand, framing the gesture in such a way that refusal could be portrayed as opposition to protecting American citizens. It was a calculated maneuver. Those who remained seated were instantly cast as villains in a narrative designed for campaign advertising rather than legislation. This is not what bipartisan leadership looks like. Genuine cooperation does not involve setting rhetorical traps on national television. It does not rely on forcing political opponents into performative displays of loyalty. That approach may energize a base, but it corrodes the possibility of serious governance. Worse still were the words that followed. From the podium of the House chamber, with the nation watching, the president referred to Democrats as reckless and destructive, accusing them of harming the country. Language of that nature carries weight far beyond a single evening. It shapes how citizens view one another. It deepens suspicion. It hardens divisions that are already dangerously entrenched. Those of us who have occupied that office understand the responsibility that comes with speaking in that room. The words spoken there echo long after the applause fades. They influence not just policy debates, but the tone of civic life itself. The showmanship that followed only reinforced the impression that performance had overtaken purpose. A professional hockey team paraded into the chamber. Medals were awarded. A Presidential Medal of Freedom was bestowed upon a goaltender during a State of the Union address. Honoring achievement is not the issue. The concern lies in the setting. The State of the Union is meant to be a sober moment of national reckoning, not a stage for spectacle. When the gravitas of presidential honors is used as political theater, Both the recognition and the office are diminished. Taken individually, each of these choices might be dismissed as stylistic. Taken together, they form a coherent picture. This was a president who came not to explain, not to persuade, and not to unify, but to perform, to energize supporters, to provoke opponents, and to dominate the news cycle. Leadership, however, is not measured by applause lines or viral moments. It is measured by clarity, restraint, and an ability to confront reality honestly. On that standard, the address fell markedly short, and it is precisely here that the concern deepens, because what followed in the speech suggests consequences far more serious than political theater. Style. This is the point at which the address moved from troubling to genuinely dangerous, not in the theatrical sense often favored by cable news, but in the quieter, structural way that undermines institutions over time. The sort of danger that resembles a slow crack in a foundation, invisible at first, catastrophic if ignored. 4 days before the speech, the Supreme Court issued a decisive ruling. By a margin of 6 votes to 3, including several justices appointed by the president himself, the court struck down his global tariff regime. This was not a marginal decision. It was a clear statement that the executive branch had exceeded its constitutional authority. Presidents are entitled to disagree with court rulings. That is not unusual. What matters is how that disagreement is expressed. In this case, the president publicly described the decision as an embarrassment to the justices' families, and then, standing just feet away from members of the court, declared that congressional action would not be necessary to reinstate the tariffs. That was not mere frustration. It was a signal, a message to the public that neither the judiciary nor the legislature would be permitted to stand in the way of presidential will. That posture strikes at the heart of the American constitutional system. The separation of powers is not an optional convention. It is the architecture that protects citizens from the concentration of authority. When a president openly suggests he will simply find alternative legal routes around an unfavorable Supreme Court ruling, he is not resolving a policy dispute. He is weakening the very framework that restrains executive power. The address then turned to elections, and this arguably was the most consequential moment of the entire evening. From the floor of the House, the president asserted that Democrats are capable of winning elections only by cheating. He described electoral fraud as widespread and demanded immediate passage of the Save America Act. No evidence was provided, none at all. This claim stands in direct contradiction to the findings of every major audit, court case, and investigation into both the 2020 and 2024 elections. None found evidence of systemic fraud. Yet the most watched political address of the year was used to tell Americans that their own electoral system cannot be trusted. That rhetoric cannot be separated from events unfolding beyond the chamber. Reports of the Department of Justice seizing ballots from Fulton County, discussion of nationalizing election oversight. When a president seeks to convince the public that democracy is broken while simultaneously moving to control its machinery, the threat is not abstract. It is immediate. Undermining confidence in elections does not protect democracy. It destabilizes it. The same pattern appeared in the discussion of the Department of Homeland Security shutdown. Democrats were castigated for refusing to fund the department, but the president omitted the reason. He did not mention that 2 American citizens were killed by federal agents in Minneapolis. That omission was not incidental. It was essential to the narrative being constructed. Institutional trust does not collapse through disagreement. It collapses through selective storytelling. When a president erases the facts that make his opponent's position intelligible, public debate ceases to function honestly. Citizens are denied the information necessary to form independent judgments. Stepping back, it becomes clear that the speech was not designed merely to describe the present, but to shape the political terrain ahead. Those who have spent years in public life learn to listen for strategy beneath rhetoric. 3 distinct objectives were being assembled, all aimed squarely at the 2026 midterm elections and beyond. First, immigration was deployed as a test of loyalty rather than a policy problem to be solved. The structure of the address ensured that any Democrat who did not stand on cue would be captured on camera and repurposed for campaign advertising. The intention was not legislative compromise, it was political branding, dividing the country into those deemed with the president and those cast as threats to public safety. This is not how serious immigration reform is achieved. Effective policy requires negotiation, trade-offs, and an acknowledgement that opposing views may still be legitimate. None of that was present. Second, the groundwork was laid to preemptively discredit the midterm elections themselves. With 9 months remaining before voting day, the message was unmistakable. If the president's party wins, the system worked. If it loses, the system was rigged. History offers ample warning of where such logic leads. Challenging electoral outcomes before ballots are cast is not vigilance. It is an assault on democratic self-government. Third, there was foreign policy, specifically Iran. 2 aircraft carrier groups positioned in the region. Language hardening from diplomacy toward ultimatum. A declaration that Iran will never be permitted to obtain nuclear weapons. This was not casual phrasing. It was the early construction of a public justification. Those familiar with the mechanics of government recognize this pattern. When a president begins preparing the public for potential military action during a State of the Union address, it warrants close attention. Conflicts of this nature do not erupt overnight. They are normalized gradually through rhetoric that narrows perceived alternatives. A foreign confrontation in the months leading up to a midterm election would dramatically alter the political landscape. Every experienced observer understands that. The significance of the speech, then, lies not in any single line, but in the architecture being assembled around it. Institutional pressure on courts, doubt cast on elections, political loyalty tests disguised as policy debates, and the faint but unmistakable drumbeat of potential military escalation. None of this guarantees a particular outcome, but together it sketches a trajectory that demands serious scrutiny. There were moments in the address that prompted cautious optimism. The Democratic response, delivered by Governor Spanberger, focused squarely on economic pressure and affordability. That was a deliberate and sensible choice. When politics becomes dominated by spectacle, the most effective counterweight is substance. Voters respond to seriousness, particularly when it reflects their lived experience. Looking ahead to the 2026 midterm elections, the political consequences of the president's approach are already coming into focus. History is consistent on this point. Elections are won and lost on economic reality. If household finances remain under strain, if grocery bills, rents, and healthcare costs continue to rise, voters will respond accordingly. A refusal to engage seriously with those pressures risks significant losses for the governing party. That said, economic dissatisfaction alone will not determine the outcome. New voter restrictions, the Save America Act, and the increasing politicization of election oversight introduce variables that cannot be ignored. Success at the ballot box will require more than persuasive campaigning. It will require vigilance in defense of fair electoral processes. That is not a partisan claim. It is a democratic necessity. Foreign policy presents a separate and potentially more volatile risk. The combination of ambiguous diplomatic language, an expanded U.S. military presence in the Gulf, and a leadership style inclined toward dramatic gestures creates genuine potential for escalation. Those who have observed decision-making at the highest level understand how quickly options narrow once military forces are in position. This is not speculation. It is an acknowledgement of how crises unfold. When rhetoric hardens and diplomatic off-ramps disappear, momentum can take over. A conflict initiated under such conditions would reshape domestic politics and international relations alike, particularly in the months preceding a national election. The Supreme Court remains another pressure point. The president's stated intention to pursue alternative legal justifications for policies already struck down ensures further confrontation. The judiciary will be tested, so will public confidence in its independence. The question is not whether another constitutional clash is coming, but whether institutional norms will withstand the strain being placed upon them. Of all the issues raised by the address, election integrity is the most troubling. If the machinery of the Department of Justice and new federal voting regulations are used to influence the conduct or outcome of a midterm election, the country will be operating in territory without modern precedent. That assessment is not rhetorical, it is descriptive. This places a significant burden on the political opposition as well. An NPR analysis recently suggested that the Democratic Party faces a reckoning ahead of 2028, a moment of reassessment about direction and identity. That diagnosis is accurate. Opposition alone is insufficient. A credible alternative must be offered. A coherent economic vision for working families, the middle class, and those who feel excluded from prosperity remains essential. That is how electoral trust is earned. It always has been. The address concluded with language about resilience and national strength. Those themes are not misplaced. The United States has endured severe tests before: Watergate, the global financial crisis, periods of profound political division that seemed at the time insurmountable. Each time, the country emerged not because of a single leader or party, but because institutions held and citizens remained engaged. What distinguishes the present moment is the convergence of pressures: executive overreach, institutional erosion, sustained efforts to undermine public confidence in elections, and the real possibility of military conflict. Systems can absorb stress until they cannot. This is why the State of the Union matters. It is one of the few occasions when a nation is meant to pause and take an honest inventory of where it stands. It is not a rally. It is not a performance. It is an act of democratic accountability. A president addressing the people's representatives with candor, restraint, and respect for the institutions that limit his own power. On this occasion, that standard was not met. Not because disagreement is illegitimate, it is not, but because the balance tipped decisively toward spectacle over substance, division over unity, and confrontation over clarity. The responsibility now shifts beyond the presidency. Democracies do not survive on autopilot. They require participation, attention, accountability. Citizens must vote. They must stay informed. They must hold leaders to account, including those they support. They must engage with neighbors whose views differ from their own. Democracy is not passive. It never has been. Those who have stood in that chamber understand the weight of the moment it represents. The speeches fade. The institutions remain, if they are protected. The American public is more discerning than any single address. No matter how long it runs, the future of the country is not determined in one evening. It remains, as it always has, in the hands of its people.